Good morning, everyone. This is Mike Kirkby-Sing from LBK Presbyterian Church. Just like to say hello to everyone. Hope you're doing well. It's April the 26th, and we are thinking about John chapter 21. And the title of my sermon is Back to Normal. We learned last Monday through our Prime Minister that our country is going to go down in alert level from level 4 to level 3. And this will mean some changes. Not quite back to normal, but a loosening of some of the restrictions we've had around what we can do. Many business people will be able to get back to work, and businesses will be able to start to reopen. Some students will be able to go back to school. So perhaps the beginning of back to normal. Who knows? Well, I'm sure for many of us this time has been quite a challenging one. For ourselves personally as a family, we've had obviously a challenge of all being being at home and learning new rhythms and routines. But of course not as challenging as for many in our world who have actually faced this virus and the experience of it. At the same time, it's made us as a family, but also I think others, made us question how we're living and our lifestyles, and whether the way we lived before the lockdown, whether that was really how we want to continue living. Do we want the same level of busyness? Do we want the same level of stress? Do we want things to entirely go back to normal? I wonder if we see things a little bit differently now, having gone through this. Perhaps we see normal in a different light. What got me started thinking about this was an article by Professor Murray Ray from Otago University. He's a professor of theology, and he wrote this in the Otago Daily Times. I wonder whether our struggle against COVID-19 helps us see reality in a new light, to imagine a different way of ordering our world. Our eyes are being opened, for instance, to how essential the lowly workers are among us. Shelf stackers, checkout operators, fruit pickers really are. We recognise now how vital they are to the well-being of all. Maybe we imagine a new reality in which they are paid what they are really worth. A living wage would be a good place to start. And then he goes on to talk about the environment. Reports are coming in from around the world about the lockdown giving our environment a reprieve. From people in smog-filled cities of China beginning to see and breathe clean air, to people in northern India being able to see the Himalayas for the first time in 30 years. Can we imagine a new reality in which the smoke stops belching from polluting factories, fossil fuels are left in the ground, and we learn to live more responsibly and more sustainably in our world? Then he writes, in cities around New Zealand, the homeless have been gathered up and given places to stay. We have found the resources to ensure that those normally excluded get to share in the common good. Can we picture a reality in which that resourcefulness becomes the norm? Those are good questions, aren't they, that Professor Murray Ray is asking. In other words, even though of course we want things to go back to normal in many ways, so that we can do business, so we can gather and do all those kind of things, perhaps there are ways in which we don't want things to go back to normal. So take farming for example. My understanding is that because of this time, for many farmers, they feel like they're being valued, being more valued, because farming is an essential part of our economy. And so if you're a farmer, maybe that's something you'd like to see continue to be a part of a new normal. And then, like I mentioned, for families, maybe a lifestyle that is a bit slower, involves a little bit less travel, but much more connection with our families. Maybe we'd like that to continue. What do you think? Will we be able to carry on with a new normal? Or when we get back to normal properly, will it go back to the same level of busyness, the same level of stress, the same level of pressure and anxiety for ourselves and for our world as well? And if it does, maybe we'll look back on that time in 2020 as a bit of a dream. In our reading today in John 21, for Peter and for the disciples, perhaps the last 3 years that they had had with Jesus felt like it was a dream. Because after 3 years with Jesus, it was as though they were going back to normal. And Peter was back to what he knew, back to the boats, back to the fishing, to his life before he met Jesus. Of course it wasn't the same. Of course he remembered all the things that Jesus did, all the things that Jesus said, and those amazing miracles and his teaching. But then in the mix for Peter, there was this shadow hanging over him. He remembered his bold declaration to Jesus, "Lord, I will lay down my life for you." And then Jesus telling them, "Peter, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And then that happened. Peter was, confronted, and 3 times Peter denied that he knew Jesus. "I don't know the man," he said. But then things got strange. The tomb that Jesus had been placed in was empty. And then Jesus was back. He'd risen again. And he was more alive than ever before. And while the disciples rejoiced and Peter rejoiced, there was still that cloud that was hanging over Peter in his relationship with Jesus. Things were not entirely back to normal for him. And so Peter's back to Galilee. He's back to the boats, back to the nets, back to the sea and the spray. Perhaps he thinks he's better off getting back to fishing. But we see, when we read chapter 21, it's not going well. All through the night they drop the nets down into the sea and they haul it up, and each time they haul it up there's nothing there. Time after time there's not a single fish. He's a failed disciple and a failed fisherman. What do you do when you go back to normal and yet it's not what you hoped it would be like? When what you hope changes doesn't, or what you hope happens doesn't, when things are not working out in life? I know that's a reality for many of us, probably for all of us to some degree or another. Things don't always work out the way we want them to. And what do we do then? Who do we call out to then? In the early morning light in the Sea of Galilee, there's someone on the shore, and the stranger calls out to the struggling fishermen, "Friends, have you caught any fish?" "No," they reply. And he tells them to try their nets on the other side of the boat, and without anything to lose they do, and there's an amazing catch, more fish than ever. "It's the Lord," one of them says, and Peter's off like a shot. He jumps into the water, and the other disciples follow along, and they see it's Jesus. And he invites them, and he cooks breakfast for them on the shore, and obviously they rejoice that Jesus is with them. However, for Peter, there's that shadow that remains, that memory of his betrayal of Jesus. It's not entirely back to normal between Peter and Jesus. And we see that in what happens next. After the meal, Jesus comes up to him and asks him a question. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" We know it's not back to normal because of the name that Jesus uses, Simon. Now, Jesus had given Peter a new name, Peter, the rock, that represented his faith, the foundation of his faith. But Jesus uses Simon, his birth name. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And 3 times Jesus asks that same question, "Simon, do you love me?" And 3 times Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." The third time, it says that Peter's hurt because Jesus asks him 3 times if he loves him. But something is going on here, isn't it? Know that Jesus is doing something. Peter, who is always so sure of himself, is probably proud of his boldness and his bold and active faith. Peter was the one who, at that kind of most fundamental level, had let Jesus down, who betrayed him and denied him. And so that question from Jesus to Peter, Simon Peter, do you love me? Is Jesus both challenging him, but also giving him an opportunity to walk back those 3 denials. Jesus, we see, is reaching out to Peter. Peter had failed Jesus, but Jesus has not given up on Peter. And it's the same for us. Jesus does not give up on us. And God does not give up on you. And friends, this is what we call grace. Grace is the new normal that God gives us. Grace is what God gives to all his children. This relationship with himself and his family because of Jesus. And so Jesus perhaps asks each of us that question, do you love me? And maybe as we think about that question, probably what's in the back of our minds is all the weakness of our faith, all the times we have denied or betrayed him. Yet may we also remember that in that question, God is also reaching out to us. And he's helping us to turn away from ourselves and turn back towards him. Away from those things that separate us from him, those disappointments, that feeling of failure. And helping us to put our trust in Jesus, in the one who by his life and death and resurrection lives forever with his Father and brings us to him. And so for Peter, Jesus reinstates him. And he calls Peter back to what he was, back to his post, back to what he had called him to be, a leader in the church. So Jesus commands him, feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep, to be a leader in the church. And so for us, we are also called like this, to follow Jesus. This is the really the new normal for all of us who have been asked that question by God, whether we love him or not. He calls us to follow him. And whatever we do, as we consider life beyond lockdown, we also should be considering how will we follow our Lord. Whatever we do in life, whether we are farmers or fishermen, or ministers or mums and dads or students or teachers, Jesus calls us to follow him. This is our new normal. And whether we live or we die, we are called to follow Christ. And as I mentioned, we also may be called to new ways of being together, ways that might be more satisfying, might be better for ourselves, and maybe better for our planet as well. And maybe that was also what God is calling us to. So a question really for us in the light of that is, how can we live out those ways when things get back to normal? And in all this, may we know that God is with us. Perhaps he's calling to us while we're in a boat, working hard. He's calling out to us. He's inviting us back to the shore to have fellowship with him. He continues to reach out to us even when those shadows in our lives remain. And he asks us, do you love me? And then he calls us, each of us, to follow him. Amen.